But first, let's talk about a bit of politics here. By the way, no sooks, no lefties tonight. You're going to love this Sunday night edition of Paul Murray Live. We deal with all the news and then sometimes sit back, have some adult conversation. As you know, the Prime Minister is the greatest of all time, according to himself or his media backers. He is, of course, from the Labor Party, which are the great champions of the workers. He even marched with workers and Anastasia Palaszczuk in the lead up to the last federal election in the May Day parade. He was, of course, on his way to becoming Prime Minister, so it was good to play a home game, low risk, rah-rah-rah for the union movement. But as you know, the reality is that there are plenty of people who this government have taken for granted, including the working class. Because you see, while yes, many people who swing a hammer are part of a union, there are an extreme number who aren't, including the people who've worked for building companies that have now gone kaput, the subbies, the people with the ABN, the sole traders, the small businesses that work for themselves. These too are the workers. There's plenty of the hi-vis population that do not work for a big company, they work for themselves. And of course, this government does nothing to help them. Because you see, the cost of living remains the number one issue in the country. It is the one where we are punished every single day, and this government has got $20 billion in surplus and has done nothing to truly alleviate it. Instead, it plays for the history books that are not read by the workers, but instead the opinion that's formed by the big end of town, the fluffy parts of the media and the academia, who of course automatically declare that being a Labor Prime Minister, he's one of reform. He's not a controversial figure. Hence why, when faced with the choice of what to spend $450 million on, the Prime Minister decided to spend it on the Voice campaign. Now, even before we formally knew what the date was, even technically what the question was going to be, the polls started to show us that this thing was heading south. But no, $450 million had to be spent. And all day, every day, this was the advocacy. Remember, never forget the priority. The day after Israel was attacked on October the 7th, the Prime Minister wasn't in a synagogue, he was crying in the dirt of Uluru because the referendum was more important that weekend than showing support to his fellow citizens. And the receipts are now starting to come in about what we have known the whole time. Working class Australians are now starting to turn their back on the Labor Party. Now, they haven't made the full conversion to voting for the Liberal Party and wanting to change the government. They're now starting to talk about things like independence, minor parties or anything but the Labor Party. But remember, the Labor Party, of course, is able to only have a third of the country vote for it, yet still form a majority government because of the preference system, which means virtually all votes of the Greens end up propping them up. Now, I think that as the time rolls on and the primary vote gets lower and the Greens vote gets higher, the chance of the Greens overtaking Labor in several inner city seats is going to be an issue. But also, it's working class base. And the working class base doesn't look like what most people who talk about a working class base actually looks like. As I say, it's more diverse, it's in the suburbs, and many of the working people who are screwed over by a government who doesn't care because they're not connected to the welfare system. Instead, the only way they get a pay rise is not going to the Fair Work Commission or arguing through the media. They literally have to get up an hour earlier and go to bed an hour later to fit one or two or three more jobs in before their day is done. And working class support is now starting to fall for the Labor Party. RedBridge, which is a polling organisation, leans very heavily left. Don't buy this garbage that it's a 50-50 one. It's a left-leaning poll. And yes, it concluded that if there was an election held today, because of those Greens preferences, Labor would probably get re-elected. But remember, there's plenty of other polls out there, including the Morgan poll, that say they won't get re-elected. Because you see, the working class, which are automatically relied upon to always vote Labor because that's what Dad did and that's what Grandpa did and that's what you should do. But again, the reality is that as we saw with the seat of Fowler, ethnically diverse in southwestern Sydney, they weren't going to put up with the Labor Party just throwing another person from Central Casting in as their local candidate. Instead, they went for a true local representative in Dai Lee. Now, of all of the things that happened on the night that they got power, that was one of the big signs about how they could lose a majority. And if they lose a majority, then we're off to the races. Let's see whether he has to form government with the Teals, with the Greens. All of that seems to be, at this case, the worst-case scenario for the government. There's not enough polling to suggest that they'd be a one-term government, but there's well and truly enough polling to tell us that they won't be anything more at this stage than a one-term majority government, and that'll be very bad for the country. One of the people who put this poll together from RedBridge said in the papers this weekend, the honeymoon is over for Anthony Albanese and he's now sleeping on the couch. The honeymoon suite phase well and truly over. The deafening sound of Australians being in love with this bloke because he had a special magical power is well and truly over. And they can see the reality of the priorities that he picks with his time, with his attention. The point also worth making here is that the only thing currently holding the dam back is the majority of voters don't believe the coalition's ready for government. So if this set of economic circumstances was there in the second or third term of a Labor government, we'd be beginning to talk about the end of that government. But because the Liberal Party has not, of course, been able to regenerate the number of people on its front bench, bring in a new collection of MPs and start to change its face from the government that was rejected about 18 months ago, the Prime Minister thinks that he'll be able to hold on to power, even in minority government, by just pointing at Peter Dutton, something that the media will more than well and truly help him with. But it is important to note again about priorities. And while this Prime Minister has unlocked many places in TAFE for people who want to become the next working class, the next tradie class of Australians, everything from hairdressers to builders and all in between, there is a relentless message because the Labor Party seems to believe that its future, while currently will be taking union money and taking workers for granted, they believe that a more educated population will always swing centre-left, and the first stop before you get to a teal or a green is the Labor Party, which is why the Prime Minister talks so often with a priority about university education. Pretty difficult to go through any of these institutions and come out anywhere near the middle, let alone conservative.
Additional university places. The university, go to university, additional university places.
You see, that's their vision for the future. It's not that your kids should be on the tools, but they should be something with a degree. And not always degrees that lead towards vocational skills. It's why there are so many people, including myself, with arts degrees that don't really help when it comes to your employment. And of course, the university business model suggests that there should only be as many places in the classroom for the kids that are smart enough to go. But because we, the taxpayer, pay for it, it's every classroom, every seat can be filled regardless of whether somebody's smart enough to ride or not, because the government will pay for it. Of course, you don't have to pay back your university education until you start earning more than $50,000, and for many who either never get to that mark or just stay in some level of perpetual education, staying inside the indoctrination system, they never have to pay it back. And that's why almost $60 billion is currently being owed to Australian taxpayers by people who have not paid back their university fees. You see, if a company owed $60 billion worth of tax, the government would go after them. But if a student owes, collectively, $60 billion worth of tax, they won't go them because they know the most important thing that the university educated do is vote left. They vote Labor or they vote Greens and they preference Labor anyway. That's why they want everyone to have a university degree. It's not because they want thousands and thousands of philosophy majors.